And now the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. Before we understood what awe was, we felt it. Before we had the language to frame it, before systems to interpret it, it arrived, untranslated, and perhaps untranslatable. A child stands at the edge of a field. It is not the first time they've seen the sky or the wind shifting over grass, but something opens in them, without warning, without instruction. This is not memory. It is a condition. The world, just for a moment, shimmers with more than light. Awe doesn't require scale. It requires rupture. Simone Weil once called attention a form of prayer, not because it summoned the divine, but because it suspended the self. Barad suggests that even matter participates in the act of observation, that perception is always an entangled becoming. None of these were writing about childhood, yet all of them point toward a threshold we first crossed when we were too young to recognize it. Awe is not a thing we encounter. It's a structure that breaks and reforms how we encounter anything. This essay does not aim to define awe or even describe it. Instead, it walks with it, across memory, silence, breath. It doesn't attempt to recover the shimmer. It recognizes that the shimmer was never lost. It's just that our systems of sense-making learn to ignore what couldn't be named. There is no claim to be made here, no argument to hold, only a loosening, a return, not to innocence, but to attunement, the kind of presence that doesn't seek comprehension, only contact. To accompany awe, even briefly, is to remember that not all knowing sharpens. Some knowing softens, some arrives with no intention at all and changes everything. The first memory is not a story, but a sensation, soft, immediate, and oddly separate from the others that followed. A swing in a park, a shadow that moved without cause, the sudden appearance of a comet-like streak above the shed roof. No adult could see it or would say that they had. But it was there, and in the child's chest something expanded like a breath held too long. That moment, though mute and barely formed, became a blueprint for everything that would later be called awe. Not in words, those came later too late, but in silence, in suspension, in the unmistakable vertigo of proximity to something bigger, brighter, ungraspable. Years passed before the feeling was noticed again. By then, it had become more difficult to catch. It receded beneath knowledge, under explanation and repetition, and yet, in the seams of ordinary life, it sometimes returned. A solar eclipse projected through pinholes in cardboard, a piece of music that seemed to come from nowhere, a wave of emotion in a museum, not for the artwork itself, but for the space it held open. These fragments were never declared as wonder at the time. They were absorbed, half forgotten, resurfacing only when something, a word, an image, a smell, unlocked the frame. The recognition came later. This was the same frequency. This was the same field. This act is about that early tuning, before ideology, before narrative coherence, before self. It suggests that awe might be the first epistemology, or at least its shadow, what arrives before systems begin. And in this formulation, wonder is not a luxury, but a condition of orientation, a lens through which the world first breaks into form. Before meaning, there was scale. Before belief, astonishment. Before identity, exposure. What it means to lose this is not yet clear. But something is carried in that early encounter, some trace that future selves will return to, even unknowingly. In this act, we do not analyze the moment. We accompany it. We walk alongside the child again to the edge of that unmarked field, and we wait without asking for the shimmer to return. Awe fades not because it is weak, but because it is too strong to be sustained. Like looking into the sun, it demands a turning away. And so we grow older. We build languages of precision, arrange facts into taxonomies, call the world by name. This act of naming, though essential, is also an act of closure. To classify is to reduce, to identify is to distance. In time, the shimmer at the edge of the field is no longer visible, not because it disappeared, but because we stopped looking for what could not be described. This is the quiet violence of growing up within systems of knowledge that reward certainty over suspension. In school, awe is rarely on the syllabus. Instead, we are trained in answers. We learn to flatten experience into testable units. Even in art and literature, where wonder might still survive, interpretation often takes precedence over encounter. We are taught how to understand the sublime, not how to feel it. Even when it returns at the birth of a child in the sound of thunder breaking over a city, it is quickly translated, assimilated, stored away. And something, each time, is lost in the translation. But wonder resists closure. It lingers in thresholds, in interruptions, in the unscripted. It appears in moments that refuse narrative, the sudden stillness in a crowd, the quiet between breaths, the way a sentence fails and silence says more. It does not seek explanation. It seeks presence. And presence in a world that prizes acceleration is itself a radical act. To reflect on this loss is not to mourn childhood, but to recognize a shift in cognitive structure, a hardening of mental form. The shift from enchantment to interpretation is not just developmental, it is cultural, institutional, perhaps even political. In a society oriented toward productivity, wonder is inefficient. It delays, it suspends. It reminds us that not all value is legible, that not all meaning is instrumental, and so we forget how to dwell in not knowing. We forget that the shimmer was never meant to be caught. It was meant to change us and to vanish. This act explores that forgetting, not as failure, but as consequence, a side effect of becoming legible to a world that no longer sees the field, only the fence that marks its boundary. What if awe wasn't a byproduct of innocence, but an epistemic challenge, one that modern thought has deliberately neutralized? To be in awe is to surrender the apparatus of mastery, to admit that comprehension is not the highest form of intelligence, that there are truths better met with silence than summary. And this, perhaps, is where philosophy recoils. For philosophy, too, seeks clarity, seeks argument. Yet there are those who refuse this demand. This is not to pit awe against reason, but to question what kinds of reasoning can accommodate awe. Most dominant epistemologies, Western, empirical, extractive, treat awe as noise, a glitch in the system. But if awe is a rupture, then it may be precisely in that glitch where new logics become possible. Not as opposites of reason, but as its radical expansions. The trembling, the hesitation, the pause before the known, these are not absences of knowledge, but the spaces where it begins again. There's a risk, of course. Awe can be weaponized. History is littered with imperial projects cloaked in wonder, explorers claiming new worlds, scientists unveiling marvels that justified violence, spectacle deployed to conceal power. The sublime, especially, has a dark undercurrent, elevating the observer, subordinating the observed. To decolonize awe is to resist this hierarchy, to ask who is allowed to wonder, whose awe counts. In reclaiming awe, then, we must tread carefully, not to romanticize ignorance or retreat into mysticism, but to acknowledge the limits of our frameworks, to make space for that which interrupts the known. This act turns inward and outward at once. It asks what kind of knowing begins with humility, not confidence, what kind of attention sees without grasping, and what kind of self survives the encounter with something it cannot contain. Somewhere in the blur of adulthood, we begin to simulate wonder. We visit natural wonders with cameras ready, sit beneath artworks we've already read about, watch documentaries where the awe is pre-narrated by familiar voices. Even our gasps are rehearsed. The world becomes content, indexed for emotional retrieval. And though the feeling flickers, the hush before a rocket launch, the swell of a choral piece, the moment light breaks in an unexpected place, it rarely lands with the same force. We anticipate it, and in doing so, we dilute it. This isn't a failure of imagination, but of interface. We are no longer in contact with things directly. Instead, we engage through frames, screens, explanations, algorithms that predict what might move us next. All becomes curated. It is no longer a spontaneous breach, but a genre, a YouTube compilation, a dopamine spike. We have not lost the capacity for awe, we have industrialized it, and in the process something essential slips away, the risk. True awe is risky, it destabilizes, it reminds us that we are not central, it does not flatter the ego, it annihilates it, if only for a moment. That annihilation is its gift, a temporary dissolving of the self into something larger, without needing to understand what that something is. But such dissolving cannot be marketed, it resists capture. It is not the product of design, but the failure of design. It comes when frameworks falter, when the world leaks through the seams. And so, in this act, we turn toward those leaks. We ask where awe survives, not in spectacle, but in slippage, in the parts of life not yet optimized, not yet legible, in the breath held between grief and beauty, in the awkward pause before saying what can't quite be said. These are not grand revelations, they are quiet breaches. And in their refusal to become content, they offer a different kind of knowing, one that neither conquers nor completes, but simply beholds. We often imagine wonder as a gateway, something that opens, but perhaps it's also a remainder, a residue left behind when certainty burns away. In this way, awe isn't just about what is seen, but what refuses to be resolved. It's the gap between stimulus and story, the instant before the world is made coherent again. And in that suspension, the self is temporarily dislocated, not erased, but reconfigured, something porous, trembling, porous again. It is here that memory plays a peculiar role. We do not remember awe as a linear sequence. We remember it as atmosphere, as a density in the air, a coldness behind the eyes, a pause that never quite ended. These are not recollections in the strict sense. They are re-entries, returns to a moment that keeps unfolding long after it has passed. And every time we revisit it, something has shifted. The shimmer changes shape. The field is still there, but the edge has moved. Philosophically, this raises a problem. If all cannot be preserved, can it still be known? Is it experience or trace? Is it an object of thought or a method of perception? This act leans toward the latter. Awe is not just a thing that happens. It is a mode, a way of looking that does not consume, a kind of attention that doesn't presume arrival. It asks nothing of the world but presence. And presence, again, is a discipline, one that our world, tuned to acceleration and productivity, finds increasingly difficult to sustain. To resist this acceleration is not nostalgia. It is recovery, not of childhood, but of attunement. To approach awe now is to do so differently, not as a return to purity, but as a recognition that impurity, confusion, and incompleteness are the conditions of real seeing. This is not a call to stop knowing, but to know differently, with softness, with gaps, with the understanding that sometimes what resists meaning is the most meaningful thing of all. Even now, in a world overwhelmed by explanation, there are places where awe survives. Not always in grandeur or rarity, but in the subtle shift of perception that occurs when we are caught off guard. It may be the moment the sea disappears in fog, the silence in a room just after someone leaves, the stillness of a satellite image, mapping something too vast to feel. It is to recognize that the world is not arranged around our comprehension. And from this recognition, a form of humility can emerge, not passive, but alert. Attentive not only to what astonishes, but to what has long been ignored. Awe, in this light, becomes a counterforce to mastery, a refusal of domination, a small, luminous no to the systems that would render everything visible, knowable, usable. In this act, we do not chase awe. We build the conditions in which it might arrive. We linger in unfinished thoughts. We make room for interruptions. We attend to what exceeds us, not because it flatters us, but because it reminds us we are not the end of the story. We are, at best, its aperture. There is a temptation to resolve awe, to transform it into belief, insight, narrative, to make it useful. But awe resists resolution. It is not the beginning of a lesson or the climax of a story. It is the part that won't fit, the part that lingers. It interrupts without offering clarity. And this precisely is its power. In a world increasingly governed by algorithms, efficiencies and certainties, awe remains an anomaly. It is unoptimized, unrepeatable, unscaled. This is not to say awe is incompatible with technology. In fact, it may be technology at its edges, in its failures, that gives rise to new forms of wonder. A signal lost in deep space, a glitch that generates unexpected beauty, a machine that responds in a way no one predicted. These are not just anomalies. They are moments in which the system reveals its incompleteness. And in that incompleteness, awe reappears, not as nostalgia, but as a threshold to something still unknown. What we do with that unknown matters. We can colonize it, package it, make it consumable, or we can protect it. Not in the sense of hoarding it, but by leaving it open, by refusing to close the circuit. This is what some traditions call reverence, not worship, but orientation. A way of holding oneself in relation to what cannot be possessed. It is a posture, not a position, a stance of careful unknowing. This act does not conclude. It suspends. It leaves us mid-breath, not because there is more to say, but because the saying was never the point. The shimmer at the edge of the field was not a message. It was an encounter, one that changed us, not with answers, but with its refusal to become one. And perhaps that is what awe demands, not understanding, but readiness, a willingness to be undone and to remain slightly undone even after the moment has passed. We return not to the field itself, but to the trace it left behind, a kind of inner topology, reshaped by something it could never quite hold. The child who once stood there is gone, but the echo remains. Not as a memory, but as a pattern in how they pause before speaking, in how they walk slower beneath certain trees, in how they sometimes look up at the sky not to find something, but to feel what cannot be found. Awe, in this final sense, is less an experience than an inheritance, something passed on, not directly, but through disposition, through the quiet transmission of attentiveness. And this matters, especially now, because what we attend to shapes what we become. In a culture that flattens perception into utility, awe is subversive. It asks us to stop, not for rest, but for reverence, not to recharge, but to relinquish. It is not a detour. It is a recalibration, an invitation to re-enter the world differently, as if for the first time, not to consume it, but to accompany it, to witness, and to let the witnessing change us. This does not mean awe will save us. That language is too neat, too instrumental. But awe might soften what is hardened. It might reopen what was closed. It might slow what rushes toward collapse. And in doing so, it offers no guarantees. Only the possibility of a different stance, not above the world, but beside it. Not as architects of meaning, but as its stewards. As those who carry, carefully, the weight of what cannot be fully known. So we end not with revelation, but with readiness. Not with a lesson, but a light, diffuse, ungraspable, and still moving across the field. And though we may never return to that original shimmer, we might learn how to notice its afterglow, how to trace its outline in the ordinary, and how, in moments brief and unbeautiful, to stand again at the edge of what exceeds us and wait.